Welcome to Boswell Book Company's virtual event series. It is day 4,653 of us being in business. Tonight's event is a Zoom webinar, so you can see us, you can hear us, but we can't see or hear you. But don't worry, we've got the chat open and also Q&A. If you want to share where you're watching us from in the chat, that would be really great. Keep your comments in the chat. We're going to have questions in Q&A. It's just another function underneath the video screen. If you send a question through chat, I will ask you to redirect it to Q&A because that's what our authors and conversation partner will be looking at. We are so honored to be hosting Meghan Sullivan and Paul Blaschko, the authors of The Good Life Method, Reasoning Through the Big Questions of Happiness, Faith, and Meaning. The book is a spectacular and beautiful, I'm a big fan of white on yellow, beautiful popular philosophy book that is inspired by a class at Notre Dame. It's been getting wonderful reviews, including this from Publishers Weekly. The entertaining and insightful approach to applying philosophy every day will appeal to readers both religious and not. Those pondering the perennial question of how to live a good life should start here. And who isn't pondering that question? I ask you, but I'm not the question asker. That is John Koethe, and he is the author of books on Wittgenstein and philosophical skepticism, 11 books of poetry, including Walking Backwards, Poems 1966-2016, but most importantly, he is Professor Emeritus of Philosophy at University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, and one of our favorite guests as a speaker, and now is a conversation partner. Let me tell you a little more about the authors. Meghan Sullivan is the Wilsey Family College Chair in Philosophy at University of Notre Dame, Director of the God and the Good Life Program, and the Director of the Notre Dame Institute for Advanced Study. Paul Blaschko is Assistant Teaching Professor of Philosophy at Notre Dame and heads up Curriculum Design and Digital Pedagogy for the God and the Good Life Program. Notably, Blaschko completed an MA in philosophy at UWM, and notably, he is also an alumnus of the Boswell Book Company School of Bookselling that hopefully leads you to an academic career. We are so honored to have the three of you tonight. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Daniel. It's such a pleasure to be moderating this with Meghan and Paul, and on their book, The Good Life Method, which it originates, as I understand it, from a course at Notre Dame, which is, I believe, the most popular course at Notre Dame. And before I ask you some questions about the book itself, maybe you could say a bit about the course and its relation to the book.
Yeah, I can get us started. So about 7 years ago, I was a newly tenured professor here at Notre Dame. I just was getting back from spending a year in Australia and Singapore on sabbatical. And I got back from that trip. I'd been teaching our really big intro philosophy course and was thinking, man, I'd really want to change it up. Like I really want to think a lot more about how we're introducing students to philosophy and why they should love it. Paul was a graduate student at Notre Dame at the time. He was also my neighbor. He's followed me around with places that we've lived in South Bend. But we would talk all the time, both at work and just like around the hallways of the apartment complex that we lived in, about how when we read Aristotle or some of these Greek philosophers 2,400 years ago, and they talk about teaching philosophy, they talk about it as teaching people how to care for their souls and like giving people advice that's going to help them achieve a more meaningful, philosophically rich kind of happiness. You read Aristotle and he's giving us his lecture notes on his philosophy course on happiness and the Nicomachean Ethics. And like the second chapter, he pauses and he says, we're not studying this so that we can know what virtue is, like not so we can know what Plato thought virtue was, but so that we can be happy. Otherwise, there's no benefit of it. And Paul and I would talk about this all the time and be like, nobody's doing this right now. We teach Aristotle like these views about happiness and growth and well-being are dead. They're only the kinds of exercises the dead Greeks and Germans could do, but 21st century people don't have these kinds of philosophical missions, but we don't believe that. And so we got a little bit of support from our kind of anxious dean and department chair here to try to build a class that was very direct on this question. Let's study philosophy so that we can care for our own souls using the advice that all of these philosophers in this virtue ethics tradition recommend. And like, let's try it out. Let's talk a lot about death and why we're like how we think about it, and try to write philosophy that's moving in the way that that philosophy in those periods was, and just kind of see where it goes. And it took off. I mean, we launched the class in a large scale way in fall of 2016. If you go in your Wayback Machine, that was a weird time. Like, you know, democracy was going through a big upheaval and a really tense election. College students are constantly on edge trying to figure out if they've got the right kinds of goals and if they know who they are and what they're going after. We kind of just stepped into this moment where people realized, oh my gosh, philosophy might be really helpful in starting to untangle some things that are getting really hard.
Yeah. And one thing I might jump in and just add here is, in the class, the major assignment that we give our students, and we say this day one, you know, because we want them to be prepared. It's kind of a weird assignment for a philosophy class, honestly, is, you know, we call it the apology assignment. So we're asking them to write what's called a philosophical apology. A lot of them are confused at first. They're like, you know, what do we have to apologize for? And so we have to explain, you know, philosophical apologies, you know, going back all the way to Socrates, and then certainly up through the tradition. You know, we give them St. Augustine's Confession as an example. They're actually, you know, they're an explanation of what you believe, and then they're an attempt to illustrate how that actually plays into your day-to-day life, right? So these apologies, St. Augustine's Confessions, are these wonderful sort of life narratives, right? They got all these details about Augustine, like stealing pears. And you're like, what does that have to do with anything? And he ties it in to his views about human nature and about, you know, our motivation, why we do what we do. So one thing that we ask our students to do in the class is to reflect on some of the big questions that we raise for them, some of the big questions that we go through in the book. Things like, you know, should you practice a religion? What would make your life meaningful? How should you treat other people? What should you sort of aspire to in your own life? And we ask them to, you know, set that down, like write out your answers and write it out as a life story, right? Like give us some arguments, but illustrate it. Like how does this actually inform sort of day to day what you do? And at first we thought, like, you know, is this going to be a good idea? Is it a total disaster? And yeah, our students have absolutely loved it. So yeah, I'll stop there, but yeah.
Okay, well, the subject of the broad subject of the course in the book is a certain idea of a good or meaningful life. And you're basically suggesting one that comes from Aristotle, which a good life is one that's, I don't know, characterized by eudaimonia or human flourishing. And I just wanted to sort of see if you could clarify a little more what that means. And there are, well, really, there are kind of two conceptions of a good life that come to mind when I think about it. And one is, well, a good life is one, you know, there's nothing wrong with it. You're not dissatisfied. You have your goals and plans. You have loved ones and family and friends that, you know, satisfy you and you're happy with. You're morally decent. And your life is relatively from conflicts, but it's basically a kind of happy, normal life. A little more positive, and here I'm thinking of the philosopher Susan Wolf's recent book, meaning on the meaningful life and why it matters, where it's a little more demanding. That a meaningful life is one where you have this personal commitment to some project or activity that's, you know, objectively valuable, be it spiritual or political or intellectual or artistic or whatever, but the two aren't the same. I mean, you could have a life that there's nothing wrong with. On the other hand, you don't necessarily have to have a life that's, kind of special or exceptional in some way. So I just wondered where your notion of a good life fits in on that.
Maybe I can kick off and then and Paul can chime in. I think one thing I'll say, when people find out that Paul and I spent the last 3 years writing a book about the meaning of life, it sounds so horribly pretentious. Like I won this little award in South Bend last summer, and they were interviewing me about what I was doing. It's like, oh, me and my friend are writing a book about the objective meaning of human life. It's like, sounds like such a strange project to undertake. And partially it's because of this question you raised, John, of like, what the heck is the question? You might think the question's super easy because like all lives are it's pretty hard to screw up your life. All lives are pretty meaningful. Or you might think that a meaningful life means become a philosophy professor or win the Olympics or some really hard, extremely specific goal that gives structure to all of your activities. And I think our view is actually a third view, and this is one, it's inspired by Aristotle, but I won't make him take the fall for it. First, like achieving a good life is not easy. And we all kind of know what we're going after. Why do I say that? Well, we all read a ton of advice columns. And even if we don't take the advice, we're very curious about offering it and curious about thinking, how can I change from where I currently am to some version of Meghan 2.0 that I think I ought to be aiming at? This is just a human impulse. There are, maybe a couple nihilists in Australia who've given up on finding goals. But for most of us, we're always like driven to try to think about ways that we can improve. And so there's some kind of thing that we want to be or function that we want to achieve that we're being pushed towards. And we also know that we can pick the wrong goals. So I can decide, in fact, I can remember when I was a freshman in college, I wanted more than anything to just be an incredible lawyer, to get into Yale and then make a ton of money and work in New York and be just the lawyer of the year. And that was my deepest desire. And that it is an objectively valuable goal. But I look back on that and think, like, why the hell did I want that so much? Like that, there's no way that that was going to be the summum bonum of my life. I think the third option is one where you think there's an objective goal that we're after, the thing that's like pushing us to read all these freaking advice columns and the thing that we worry about, especially on New Year's. But it's probably not just a specific kind of objective value that we might choose for ourselves, like being a lawyer, being an excellent poet. That might be part of the goal. But for it to be a philosophically meaningful life, it's got to be integrated. You can't just decide I'm going to be great at Catholicism, but suck at politics and being a friend and being a good member of my community or my workplace. Like the good life is integrating all of these functions, and a really pointy person is not going to be somebody that's achieved eudaimonia, this thing that Aristotle says is our goal.
Yeah, and the way I describe what Meghan was saying right at the beginning is, I think of Aristotle as kind of like the mascot or the spirit animal of our class. So we definitely sort of depart. We take Aristotle as like a point of departure. And on day one, one of the thought experiments that I give our students is, we start with this question, okay, who wants to be happy? And of course, my freshmen think I'm trying to trick them, and they all slowly raise their hand. And then I ask, okay, but let's think seriously about what happiness actually is. And without reflecting a ton on it, I think a lot of us would say, well, look, it's this kind of feeling that you get, and if you feel sort of well, like most of the time, yeah, you're happy. Okay. One of the thought experiments that we then sort of try to use to push our students to think a little bit deeper about this as a goal is we say, well, okay, consider, this possibility. Consider if we were able to give you just a pill, right? Call it the pleasure pill, right? You take the pleasure pill and you are just constantly euphoric for the rest of your life. Would you do that? Like, do you want to do this? And all of them say, well, no, of course.
Robert Nozick's thought experiment.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. We get to the experience machine. Yeah, absolutely. And of course, our students say, well, no, that of course we wouldn't want to do that. Okay, so if we want to be happy, right, but we wouldn't take the pill, well, that means that happiness has sort of a different shape than we might have originally thought. Now, the way that Meghan and I proceed through the book is we start considering, okay, let's look at different virtues. Let's look at different traits of character. Let's look at different areas of life that might help us sort of make that shape more concrete and help us think about, how we would achieve it over the course of a life. So just as an example, the first chapter, we talk about truth and the love of truth and why we think this is an important virtue to have. In some of the other chapters, we talk about love and attention and the way that this plays a role in our lives. Of course, relationships come in here, friendships come in. And we sort of go, step by step, and we say, we think each of these sort of, objectively is really important for you to consider if you're trying to plan out, structure, sort of write the plan for a life that's deeply and meaningfully happy. And we certainly share our experiences throughout. We give our apologies throughout the book. But we also, very much want to invite students and readers into this process. And we want to say, don't just believe us, let's argue about it. Let's actually ask the questions. What is objectively meaningful? Should you practice religion, whatever it might be?
That's the kind of the point of the book, what you mean by the good life method, which is
Yeah.
this kind of process of interrogation.
Exactly.
And of course, that involves a lot that is involved in your conception of what morality and ethics involves. And I just wanted to ask you briefly to clarify that. You talk about what's called virtue ethics, where acting, is a matter of following through on certain character traits or dispositions like generosity and love and where and you contrast that with a kind of tradition called consequentialism, which says that, well, look, to do the right thing is to do what's best overall, or what makes everyone happiest, or something like that. Usually when you, in introductory ethics courses, you also include something called, well, funny word, deontological, but basically it means views of morality derived from Immanuel Kant, which says that, look, the point of morality is duty and rights and treating others as kind of ends in themselves. And that it's not mentioned in your book. So I just wondered how that fits into this, because it seemed like it's obviously a very important view. It's kind of hard to spell out, but could you talk just briefly about that?
Sure. So we, in class, almost every semester, we teach a little bit of Immanuel Kant's groundwork for the metaphysics of morals. In particular, we teach about moral luck and his ideas about how the only thing that's good in and of itself is having a good will. Like the only thing that's going to make your life good is willing to follow morality, in particular, willing to not inflict on anyone something that you wouldn't will to be a universal law. So we teach that, and we have great arguments and discussions with our students about it. One of our colleagues is a German philosopher who specializes in Kant, and is a good friend of mine, and was definitely talking with us a lot as we were writing the book. And she was scandalized when she found out that Kant got cut from the final thought. The idea that Immanuel Kant would not be in this book that's meant to introduce people to philosophy. She just thought we lost our minds. I think for this particular, we do not assume in any way that we pick our 10 favorite philosophers who in various ways have shaped our pursuit of this idea of eudaimonia, or flourishing. And they don't all agree with each other or even fit in the same camp. But one of the things Paul and I show, following this Aristotelian method, is you take the ideas of the philosophers and you kind of apply them to the particular challenge that you've been dealing with. And you look for that depth and harmony. And if it doesn't harmonize, you also question the philosophy. And we found with the 10 that we picked for the book, they really fit well with the kinds of life problems that in the last, 36 to 39 years, we've really had to come up against. But I have not had a big Kantian crisis yet in my life that generates the Kant chapter for the book. I totally think that other people do. The closest I got to a Kant crisis was having jury duty a couple of years ago. But I think our rationale is you don't have to talk about Kant just because he's Kant. You should
Well,
pick
I guess-
these philosophers because you should pick philosophers for this kind of work in philosophy because they're speaking into the kinds of problems that we're dealing with right now and doing it in a great way.
I guess what made me ask is that, I mean, the impetus of virtue ethics is what I do in my motives, whereas the impetus of Kant's, deontological ethics is what you owe others or what you do to them. So it's kind of a difference between a first person and a second person perspective on morality. And
Yeah.
I don't see any conflict, but
There's a great question in the literature about whether Kant even counts as a virtue ethicist or not. He talks about virtues a lot in other parts of his writing. I think one thing that's really interesting, and Paul might have views on this as well, a huge criticism of the project that we have as virtue ethicists and in this book is that we make everything about you, about your development, the development of your character, your meaningfulness and happiness. And you don't matter that much. We should care about the universe. We should care about like the kingdom of ends in a Kantian framework.
Yeah.
And real morality, capital M morality, will eliminate self-regarding ideas or self-concern.
yeah, well,
And we
that's
totally reject that. I mean, Paul, that's one of the things we're ready for that, want that fight to happen. That's an interesting fight. So Paul, you want to talk about like why we're kind of self-centered, but why we're not that self-centered?
I got two thoughts here. So one is, I think this is totally right? There's a common criticism of virtue ethics that it's just self-centered in exactly the way that Meghan was describing a second ago. We're just thinking about ourselves, our characters. One of the ways that we kept coming up against this and kept sort of thinking about what resources there are in the virtue tradition to get around it is in this kind of abstract, kind of old, notion of a common good. And this idea that, you can conceive of happiness as the sort of thing that can happen to me, right, in the course of my life, or you can think of it as the sort of thing that you experience in community, right? So there's a lot of thinkers, even contemporary thinkers who really emphasize this idea that our ends, our goals in life are not just individual, they're common. They're things that we share with other people. If I'm super happy, if I sort of achieve my goals and maybe even, become virtuous in some respects, but my family's miserable, like I'm not happy, I'm not flourishing, right? So one way that we, try to draw on some philosophical resources to respond to, I think, the really real and important criticisms here is just by using this idea of common goods. One other quick just thought, because you mentioned the consequentialists, and we do talk about the consequentialists quite a bit in this book. One reason why I think Meghan and I take consequentialism really seriously in the book is because there are a lot of consequentialists out there in the world right now working in a very similar vein to the one that we're working in, and I really respect them for it. So I think about the effective altruists like Peter Singer, right, and the effect that he's had culturally. Like some of my students come in sort of vaguely familiar with consequentialism because they've somehow heard of Peter Singer, and it's a really compelling view, right? And one that I think really needs to be put in conversation with virtue ethics for a bunch of reasons, some of which we have in the book. But I will say that's that's just sort of one of the reasons why that ends up being a flashpoint at various parts of the book, is because I think the picture that they have is in many ways pretty compelling and sort of needs to be answered and responded to.
Okay, well, let's turn to the other half of the course, the religion half, which I thought was really fascinating in the book, since it's, as you acknowledge, most philosophers are not religious, and they tend to be atheists or at least agnostics. Yet, in your course, you really take religion very seriously and try to sort of locate it as a component in the good life, or at least allow it to be a component of the good life. So I'd like to kind of explore that a little. And I guess first to start, just your conception of religion. I mean, there is a view of religion, which is, I've always thought, a little mealy-mouthed, which is, sees it as a kind of feeling of spirituality and community. And but you, at least if I read you right, you come down rather strongly for identifying religion with a set of beliefs, and particularly in both of your case, Catholic beliefs. So it's doctrines. It's not ways of life, whatnot. You talk about Elizabeth Anscombe, who was a very doctrinaire Catholic philosopher, but also a student of Ludwig Wittgenstein's, who was somewhat sympathetic to religion as a kind of a way of life, but didn't sort of see it as, involving specific beliefs. So maybe just to start, if you could talk briefly about, do you identify to be religious? Does that involve certain beliefs about God, the Virgin Mary, or whatever the religious tradition is? Or is it something vaguer and more spiritual in a kind of amorphous sense?
I can kick it off on this. Paul and I were talking about this morning when we were over in the philosophy department, about how if we achieve anything with this project, it might be just keeping Catholicism weird for people. Like they think they know what the doctrines or what the way of life is, but in fact, it's a lot more vibrant and interesting than maybe you read on the internet. Not in your case, John, but something that we think is a really important role for philosophers, especially religious philosophers, to play right now. In the 5th chapter of the book, we tackle this question of what exactly is a religion, and is it just a kind of set of practices that you think guides your day-to-day life in important ways? Is it a set of beliefs about things that did or didn't happen in Jerusalem 2,000 years ago? What is it's a philosophical question about what makes something a religion. And what Paul and I try to argue for, and what we suggest to our students, is religion is a bit more than just a way of life. Exercise can be a way of life, like veganism can be a way of life, but becoming religious or adding religion to your good life is having a much more comprehensive idea of the good that's guided by those teachings and those practices. And that still leaves a lot of room for lots of different things to be religions, but it also kicks some things out. You might say, Paul and I both go to this pretty intense gym here in South Bend called Primal. And Primal is a pretty big part of our lives, but it's not a religion, because there are lots of questions about the good life that Primal just doesn't weigh in on, the same way that Judaism or Christianity or Islam weighs in on what that idea of our final goal is. We are not trying in the book to convince anybody to go Catholic. We hope we show how weird and wonderful it's been in our own lives, in the process of showing how we wrestle with philosophers when we're dealing with questions about our own spiritual lives. And we definitely don't think people should be religious and not care about the spiritual dimension of the personal spiritual ways that they're going to engage with these ideas. But I think one thing we do kind of want to push back on is this tendency to think that philosophy leads people away from organized, established world religions. We don't think that's a really recent development, I think, in academic philosophy. And in fact, there's a lot of great traditions of thinking really openly and caring about the truth and arguing that push you into a deeper understanding of religion and God, and can actually move you in that direction instead. And that's certainly been our personal experience, which we try to show in all of its complexity and weirdness to readers who might be skeptical. And we do this with our students who then kind of get a roadmap for how they want to argue about it.
Yes, I thought one of the most interesting parts of the book was your discussion of William James on the will to believe, where you, I think, rightly debunk the idea that, well, for religious beliefs to be acceptable, they have to be somehow justified or supported by argument or evidence, which is, I've mentioned Wittgenstein before, but that's not really true of our non-religious beliefs. In uncertainty, just in life, there are lots of things we just take for granted, and we don't have arguments for them. We just do it. But what I thought was interesting in the William James thing is you mentioned that for anyone, and your students in particular, to be open to religious beliefs and for them to be rational, they have to be what you call live. I mean, it has to be something you can really be open to. And it rang a chord with me because I was brought up as a devout Catholic and went to Catholic school through the 6th grade. And then my mother restaged the Reformation and we became Lutherans. And I was, if anything, more devout. But by the end of high school, it just all fell away. There was no deconversion experience, but it just began to seem quaint, and I didn't understand why I would ever believe, why I ever took it seriously. So it wasn't in that sense a live option anymore. And I think that's, I think it's right to sort of not require evidence, argumentation, and justification for religious belief, but it does have to be live. And I wonder what if it isn't on your view for people? Can they sort of fall, can they have lives that are meaningful and happiness without that religious component? And I guess that's the larger question. I mean, how it's wonderful that you allow philosophically significant conceptions of a good or meaningful life to include religion, but what if the upshot of this method that you're talking about, this philosophical method, is that it leads you away from that, or not, at least not towards it?
Yeah, I'll jump in first if that's all right. I think one of the really wonderful things about William James is exactly as you said, John. Look, the way that he compares religious faith to any number of everyday experiences that we have, or sometimes really momentous experiences that we have, right? When I was trying to figure out with my wife, Shayla, like whether we should get married, like whether we should commit our lives to each other for the rest of our lives, it's not as though I ever reached a point of like deductive certainty. Like I was never like, well, here's the argument. Like I'm totally, completely sure that we're going to be happy forever, into the future. It required, what William James calls a leap of faith. You just sort of, you go and you say like, okay, like here's the evidence for, here's the evidence against, and yeah, I'm going to make a commitment here. So I think that's wonderful. I think the experience that you were describing here, and maybe not, in your particular case, but I think in a lot of cases, when a view about religion sort of becomes live or stops being live for somebody, like that itself is a momentous occasion, right? In my own life, I've gone through sort of periods where your religious faith gets called into question by some crisis, some external crisis. And it's just a really good, interesting sort of puzzle. Like, what do you do in that case? I think the sort of resource that I take from William James in this case is that we can't fall into wishful thinking, right? Like as a philosopher, as a religious philosopher, I don't ever want to counsel anybody to just say like, well, just believe, like just continue to believe no matter what, right? And this is, the way in which this idea of a hypothesis being live is really valuable. It helps you sort out, like, is this something you could actually believe? So then the question becomes, okay, so like, how do you make that decision? And for William James, there's a way in which the authenticity of that decision and sort of recognizing, whether the thing that you're trying to believe or not, whether that would be sort of an authentic way for you to live. That's one way in which I think, he just provides us with the resources to think through this. Sorry, this is abstract. Let me give you like a really concrete case. One of my students, one of the sort of my favorite students that I worked with in the class and have continued to work with throughout, is just, he was Catholic and now he is just adamantly an atheist. And he thinks like, this is definitive of him in the same way that like, I feel like my Catholicism is definitive of me, right? And while we totally disagree about, objectively, like, is there a God? Like, is it a good thing to pray or to go to church? Could prayer be efficacious? We totally disagree about those things. One thing that we share in common is this idea that it's better to live authentically in light of your commitments, right? It's better to think you're living out the truth as you see it than it is to sort of lapse into wishful thinking on either end, right? So that's one way in which I think, James gives us some insight in here. I think the existentialists, who I think, we've talked about a little bit, are also really good here. I mean, Kierkegaard and well, Nietzsche more controversially, but anyway, those are my thoughts.
Megan?
Yeah, I think one thing that's really interesting about James, and Will to Believe, he talks about how different options are alive for individuals. Kind of like Paul said, for our friend Sam right now, it's not like Catholicism, that island, the lights have gone off. It's not really a live like pad that he could leap to. But there's this interesting question about how you make options that seem dead come alive again. If you're the kind of person that wonders, like, I fell away from my Catholicism as a teenager, or became Lutheran and then became an atheist. Am I kind of stuck where I am right now, or are there other ways of life? Is there a religion I could join? And why or why not? Why are some options authentic or live to some people and non-authentic or not live to others? That's a really interesting question. And James doesn't address that one head on. He just kind of assumes they're on or off. But I think something Paul and I think a lot about, and talking with a lot of young people who are in this like figure it out mode, realize that there might be some work within these traditions like Catholicism that we ought to be doing to flip the lights back on, to make options really seem live and vibrant, like ways of life people could choose if they're starting to feel cold or non-authentic. So there might be some responsibility that we have for like enlivening the things that people are meant to take the risk on.
Okay, well, since we're getting close to the question period, but that leads to the last thing I wanted to bring up on this kind of in this skeptical vein. Leaving even religion aside, basically the method you're talking about is one of self-interrogation and examination and trying to identify what makes your life significant or meaningful or worthwhile. And what if the result of this kind of interrogation is that you nihilism might be too strong, but what if you wind up at a kind of existential in a kind of existential position that, well, really there is no significant or value to this. I'm thinking of Thomas Nagel's paper, The Absurd. And is that somehow compatible with having a fulfilling, or, the desire for truth just leads you? I mean, would that kind of honesty, if that's your conclusion, provide a consolation or something that makes your life meaningful, is that within your framework or not?
I think, yeah, I mean, I can just start. I do think we are pretty optimistic from the beginning of the book that there's going to be an optimistic sort of generally, but also that there are going to be sort of substantive, objective values out there, and that these are connected up with our soul and our character as we talk about it. So, in a way, we are inheriting a lot of, maybe smuggling in a lot of assumptions from the virtue tradition. But I would say one of the big heroes of the book is Socrates, right? We introduce Socrates right at the beginning. And something that we take from Socrates is this commitment, to the examined life and to living an examined life. In our class, one of the most cited quotes in students' final apologies is, "The unexamined life is not worth living," right? And I think what's really powerful about that idea is that it's, a way of loving or committing yourself to the truth. And I certainly think, I can't speak for somebody who has sort of a nihilistic worldview. I don't really know what it looks like from the inside to see the world in that way. I certainly know that, there are a lot of people that I respect, especially in philosophy, who hold these views and have meaningful, rich lives. I've been reading a lot of Albert Camus and Jean-Paul Sartre lately. And as I read through those, I find a richness and a meaningfulness that, resonates with me. Okay, but so not pretending like I totally understand, what life would look like from the inside there. I would say, the value that comes through in that Socrates quote is one that certainly motivates me. So, if I came to be convinced that there wasn't objective meaning and value in the world, I would absolutely say like it's time to, embrace the absurd. It's time to like live authentically in light of that fact, rather than, deceive myself or sort of live under an illusion. So yeah, I mean, absolutely.
I think one of the things that that moved us to write the book and like drives us with the course and inspires us as philosophers is thinking happiness is the kind of thing that we can work on really intentionally and systematically. But there are a lot of like substitutes out there that can make you think that that it's a lot easier than it really is. And so one example, we talk about this a little bit in the introduction to the book, but there's a ton of advice right now that tries to take the kind of testing, prototyping, experimental systems that are used for product development in Silicon Valley and applying these to like making big life decisions. There's a lot of self-help books in this tradition. There are college courses that are in this tradition. And that method might be helpful if you're a really elite undergraduate trying to decide whether to go into management consulting or to go to law school. But that kind of method is not going to help you figure out why your loved ones get sick with terminal illnesses. It's not going to help you figure out how responsible you are for a marriage falling apart down the road. It's not going to help you answer really big questions about whether or not you're finding the right kind of meaning in your work, working for a major national corporation, doing a little piece of a really complex puzzle that's hard to understand. There are these big existential problems that all humans face. They're not fake problems or ancient Greek problems. They're just like problems of trying to make it in this weird, difficult world that are much deeper and more serious than positive psychology or this kind of like test and prototype methods can handle. And that's why we've always needed philosophy and why there's such staying power for Plato and Aristotle and Elizabeth Anscombe and Thomas Aquinas. And so we want to kind of remind people that when they hit the bigger challenges, and they are coming, that that these resources are available as well. And that is the kind of optimism, but it's not an optimism that says if you like Marie Kondo all your drawers, then life is going to be good. Philosophy doesn't work in that quick time scale, and you might have to go to some really dark places before you get out of the cave.
Okay. Well, and that's what's so admirable about the book. Its accommodating nature, and its sort of willingness to allow that this method could lead you anywhere and still wind up with a certain integrity. I think Daniel, are you with us? Or I think it's about time for the audience to weigh in. I'm not sure how we're going to work this, Paul. I think you were going to.
So I can take the first question here. So if folks who are watching have questions, they can plug them into the Q&A function, and those will show up, and we can read those, and we'll sort of tag team these and start answering. I'll take the first one if that's right, Megan. So Michelle Quinn asks, what compels people to take a leap, maybe of faith or maybe to depth, and leave what is known? Is it a crisis? Maybe an internal crisis or shared crisis? Is it wonder at others who are living their bliss, or what might it be? Can you speak toward what your students find persuasive and what distinguishes you or aligns you with the virtue ethicist? So let me talk a little bit about the leap of faith question. And I think, thinking about crises as like a jumping off point is really apt. One of the things that I do when I start talking about William James with my students and start talking about, what might compel you to take a leap like this, is I look at this notion from Alistair McIntyre. He's one of my favorite philosophers. Megan, you're gonna just hate me for breaking up McIntyre. I had to do it. But he talks about this experience that I think a lot of us actually have, right? Which is a crisis where, you're going through the world, and then suddenly the world becomes unintelligible to you in some really crucial respect. You thought you understood, how something worked, and then suddenly you just realize you don't, right? So the case that McIntyre gives is he says, you think you understand, what it means to be friends with the people around you. You think you're friends with your colleagues at work, and then suddenly one day you show up and they're like, yeah, you're fired. We don't care about you. Okay, he says, in that moment you become paralyzed, right? Because the schema, the sort of mechanism that you use to interpret the world to make other people, other minds intelligible to you has proved inadequate, right? And a lot of times those are crises. Those are really paralyzing and painful experiences. And so he says, in that situation, you can't go on. You can't put yourself in that situation again until you somehow replace the thing that you were using to interpret the world, to interpret the world around you. Now, one of the things that's cool about William James is that the way that you resolve this, it can be a leap of faith. Like you might just need to commit yourself to something again. Okay, I'm just going to commit to this understanding of how sort of friendship works around me or whatever else. But one thing that he thinks is absolutely crucial is that you don't lose sight of the fact that when you're taking a leap of faith, it's because you're hoping that what you're leaping to is true, right? So you're being guided by truth the entire time. You're sort of, you have that as the value that's guiding you. So that was a lot of thoughts. I would recommend, maybe, I don't know if I'd recommend. I recommend like dipping into the Alasdair MacIntyre essay on this. I think it's really good, where he talks about epistemological crises. But I think that's a really good question. I think that's really apt. Let's see. Are you able to see these, Megan?
I got it. And I'll say too, with the questions, like put anything, if you even just have like, what do you think the biggest philosophical challenges to the good life? We'd love to hear a little bit more from you guys, but we've got some great questions in here. The next one's from Peter Goldberg, who says, speaking of issues that are pertinent to today, do you look to philosophical dialogists like Levinas, who say that philosophy begins with an ethic of engaging the other and hence listening and working to hear others and then God beyond? We don't talk about Levinas in the book, and we cut Kant, so a lot of people didn't make it into this version. We're going to have to get the publishers to let us to do some sequels, but we do have a chapter, one that I'm really proud of, in the middle of the book on the role that love and attention play in the good life. That chapter opens with a novel that Paul and I have both found really important in our philosophical lives, Cormac McCarthy's The Road, and I won't spoil it for you guys if you haven't had a chance to read it. But the basic premise of the book is this father and son are fleeing this apocalypse. And a lot of the book hovers on the father just paying attention to his young son and seeing a lot of the beauty that's left in the world in this little boy, and not ever really, the little boy's aware of it, but it's mostly like going on in how the father sees and perceives the good in this other person. And Paul and I talk in the chapter about how a lot of us think that we need to build up our capacity of love in order to achieve happiness, in order to achieve eudaimonia. But a lot of the advice around getting better at love is advice about what you do to other people or how you put other people in relation to yourself, rather than thinking about how you attend or think about or contemplate other people, which just makes it seem maybe mystical, but in fact is quite practical. We talk about Simone Weil and, really importantly, this philosopher Iris Murdoch from the 20th century, who's in the same kind of camp as Weil, who focus on things that we can do to help us really start to engage other people and their good lives imaginatively and in our own mental and intellectual life, without necessarily trying to control them or do things to them, but instead to perceive them the way we perceive things that are beautiful. And I think that skill of developing the ability to really look intellectually and with your heart at the people that you love, your friends, your family, the people who are your second selves, that's how Aristotle and some of the ancients would put it, that cultivating that skill, if you're then going to move on to a pretty intensive personal God religion like Christianity, that skill is going to be extremely important, because a major part of finding the good in Christian life is being able to pay that kind of attention to the divine mind, which again, it gets mystical pretty fast. But one of the things we love about Murdoch, and honestly Aristotle, when he's talking about love and friendship, is that they do give advice for how to train yourself to think in different scripts about other people, and how to make love this interior journey just as much as it is trying to do things with and to other people.
So we got another question here from Natalia Palatnik. Natalia asks, how does the idea of a leap of faith fit with the Socratic demand for examining one's life, asking for the rational basis of why you do what you think you do and think? So I think this is fantastic. And I think, you're right to sort of see that there's a tension between these views. And throughout the book, we're looking at a lot of different philosophers who ultimately do hold incompatible views. I don't think Socrates would be sort of on the same page as William James. I don't think Socrates would maybe look that kindly on leaps of faith. Oh, I don't know. He's more of, in philosophy, what we call a skeptic, or he's a very skeptical philosopher. He thinks, I would rather not believe anything than believe the truth, if that means, sort of taking a leap of faith into the unknown. I'd rather sort of, remain agnostic. So I do think there's disagreement between the two. One of William James's sort of fiercest debate partners was this guy named William Clifford. And he's what we call an evidentialist. And so William Clifford thought, look, he was on the same page as Socrates here. He was pretty skeptical. He thought, if you ever believe anything and you don't have adequate evidence for it, you are doing something that is morally impermissible, is inexcusable. There's, I think, people that fall on both sides of questions like these. Should you actually ever take leaps of faith? I think William James argues persuasively, well, we've just got to. I think, you can't really move through the world and live a sort of a good life unless you do. Maybe you think, Socrates is a counterexample to that, but I don't know. I don't know if I would want to live the life Socrates lived. He was walking around Athens, just unshaven. I guess I'm unshaved, but just asking questions constantly. He wasn't doing a lot of productive work otherwise, other than that. So I think, anyway, this is all just to say, I think you're totally right to think there is a tension between these views. And it's one that's, in our class, we encourage our students to really take a side on that debate and say, yeah, actually, I side with James here, or I side with Socrates. But certainly they also have some things in common, like a commitment to the truth in general. That's a fantastic question.
In a similar vein is pointing out a tension that comes up all the time in our course, in our philosophical conversation. Cindy Olson asks, so does religion require an affiliation if one is to live authentically? Can you live religiously without having a religion? And this is a question I get all the time from the really smart folks that we teach here at Notre Dame and who want to debate with us about religion. I think the philosopher's answer is affiliation is not a part of making religion part of your good life. If you think of affiliation, at least, as how you change your Facebook profile, the religion question, you put in Catholic or Jewish, or it's filling out a card saying that you're now going to be a member of this particular parish, or self-declaring to be a member of a group. A lot of philosophers are going to say that act in and of itself doesn't have a ton of philosophical depth. It might have a lot of political importance because it's going to put you with that group for whatever ways we're going to arrange society. But as far as its effect on your character and how you're developing, just affiliating is or not affiliating is pretty minor. The same way as uploading this profile picture versus that profile picture. It's kind of a small little step in the scheme of things, but not anything that the world should hinge on. Now that said, it is interesting to think whether you can wrestle with the really big questions that somebody who's trying to live religiously, questions about who is God, what is God like, why does this kind of suffering happen in the world, and more importantly, what am I obligated to do to try to alleviate it, and what is the best way to love and care for other people. Thinking that you can on your own steam figure out all of those pieces of the puzzle of what it's going to take to live religiously without folks to talk to and debate and contemplate with, and without getting some pointers from folks who spent their entire lives wrestling with it, that's pretty freaking hard. I mean, there are some religious geniuses in history who managed to figure it all out, or like St. Paul, they just got hit with a bolt of lightning and then all the information got downloaded into their brain. Most of us don't work that way. Most of us just need tons and tons and tons of help to figure out how we are going to incorporate these really big elements of spirituality into our lives. And that's where religions that are functioning really well and religious institutions are here to help. They're here to be that place where that conversation and that encounter can happen with getting the right kinds of information and experiences and the opportunities to be worshiping the God that you're thinking so much about. That's going to happen in these institutions, and that can be really important. And that can maybe be hard to do if you only are ever dipping your toes in and not taking the leap.
So one other great question here that I want to jump in and answer is, do you and how do you distinguish happiness from joy? I'm thinking of saints who suffer and their testimony. I think this is a really great question. And it goes back to, the first day of class for us in God and the Good Life, and asking, whether happiness is compatible with a life in which there is, profound suffering, sometimes profound suffering. I think, and I'll just say briefly, I think one of the really cool things about Aristotle and about Aristotle's approach is that, there's room on that approach for thinking that an ultimately happy life, a life in which you're flourishing, isn't one where you're just sort of, feeling, joyful or happy all the time, but it's one where, there are episodes, occasions where you have profound suffering or profound difficulties and you have to find a way to come through it. You might even think that you can't really develop the virtues or the traits of character that you ultimately need to flourish, to sort of be a happy person, if you don't have some of those struggles or some of those episodes in your life. So I think, thinking about what exactly that looks like and the limits of it, because I don't want to like undersell sort of, the difficulties of certain kinds of suffering. I mean, it certainly could be the case that there is suffering that can just destroy one's character, or could be totally incompatible with acquiring certain virtues. But I do think there's something really plausible to this idea that a life in which there's no suffering, I mean, it's not going to be deeply happy in the way that Aristotle at least really wants us to be thinking about happiness. Oh, we got a Joseph Pieper question.
You want to close with Pieper? Paul loves Pieper.
Sure. Sure. So
he gets a page in our book.
The question is just whether Joseph Pieper figures into the book. Do we end up having that quote in there, Meghan?
Yeah, we have at least one Pieper page.
We got a quote from Joseph Pieper. My favorite idea, and we barely referenced Joseph Pieper, but he certainly had a huge impact on me, especially as I've been thinking a lot this semester about work and the good life and what it means to sort of be a working person in the world and be pursuing happiness. One thing that I find, what's that?
And we've got a whole chapter on that question. We have a whole Pieperian inspired chapter on that question in this book.
Absolutely. And one thing that I take from Pieper that I think is just really profound is this idea of contemplation and leisure as having a really important role to play in what it means to be happy and to flourish. And it's something that I think, it's easy for us to lose sight of. I mean, this is even something that Pieper argues for in this book that he wrote called Leisure is the Basis of Culture. He says, in our contemporary world, we've packed our lives so full of action, and we've construed happiness as an achievement, as something that we get if we check off all of these major goals on our list. We've become so sort of sucked into that way of thinking that we've lost touch with this thing of real value. I mean, he certainly thinks those things are good. Like, don't get me wrong, like the life of action is a good thing, but he thinks there's also something else. And this is something at the very end of the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle says. He says, look, one of the sort of fundamentally valuable things in a good life is to be in touch with reality, to contemplate the truth. And when he starts talking about it, it gets very mystical. It gets, I don't know, like to my mind, it sort of gets almost poetic. And he even gives up at some point. He says, you know what, this part of the good life, like I can't even really explain, how it's possible or what it looks like, because it goes beyond what it is to be human, right? I think that's profound. I think that's one of these insights that, Pieper certainly recognizes and thinks a lot about, and that I just carry around with me. Because I think like, yeah, okay, what does it mean to be sort of sufficiently contemplative, to be, trying to put yourself in touch with reality through reflection? What does that actually look like in the context of a good life? Because it seems to me like it's incredibly important, but it's also pretty mysterious. But I love Pieper. I totally recommend checking out his stuff. Yeah, good. Any other questions you want to answer, Meghan? Should we? I know we're short on time. Maybe we can bring Daniel back in to close out the event.
Well, What happened to John?
What?
His
What
voice
happened
is here, but I believe he's frozen.
Oh,
But his
Oh,
voice
there
is
you-
here.
let's see. Nope. Yeah, it doesn't, it says his video is still on. Well, we know he's here in spirit. I want to thank him for doing a fantastic job. I want to thank both of you, congratulate you on your success, on the course's success, on the book success. It's only been out for 2 days. Can you imagine what day 3 will be like? But for us, 2 will be a highlight. So thank you both so much. And thanks everybody for joining us. We wouldn't have a bookstore without you. Any last words from either of you?
I want to say, I just want to say thank you. I mean, I have been telling everybody in my life that this is like literally a dream come true for me. Like you said, Daniel, I worked at Boswell, and I distinctly remember actually seeing John Koethe in Boswell one time and just thinking like, that is the poet John Koethe in Boswell books. It was all so surreal. And, like even back then, I just, had this dream of writing and doing an event like this at Boswell. And so I'm just so grateful for you guys for putting this together, for John for, being a great host for it and moderating. Anyway, I'm just so grateful. Thank you so much. And thank you to everybody who supports Boswell. I'm so, so grateful.
Yeah, I mean, you have no, oh, go ahead.
It
I
was
was gonna
such a pleasure to read the book and to think about it and to talk about it with my wife, Diane, who supplied some of the ideas that I asked you about. So it was a wonderful experience.
Thank you.
I think on our end, like Paul said, there's this really funny picture of Paul and his kids at the Barnes and Noble in our local mall yesterday, finding the book on a shelf. And you have no idea how much that means to us, that there are books on shelves that you can acquire, and that we can be part of that conversation. We really hope you guys will check the book out and use it to get into arguments with your family members and just enjoy it. And please send us questions and ideas that you have. This is a long extended conversation between us and our students and our families. And so getting to do philosophy with y'all and hopefully share it. And we're so grateful for Boswell's for just keeping ideas alive, just being the battery by which these ideas get transmitted is it's something that we definitely don't take for granted.
Well, here's to bookstores and libraries, keeping those ideas coming. This book is going to be a great discussion book too. I'm sure there'll be like philosophy groups sprouting up, devoted to analyzing the books. It'll be wonderful. Thank you both. Have a great evening, everybody. Hope to see you at another event.
Thanks, guys.
Bye, everyone.